Hey, so this one I'm going to detract a bit from the subject I've been speaking about a lot recently, which is the US primaries, and I'll go come to an issue that's a lot more closer at home and probably a lot more consequential for us as a country. Well, definitely a lot more consequential for us as a country, and that is the potential of an EU referendum. Now, I've deliberately avoided making videos on this subject up to this point simply because I haven't spent significant time looking at both sides of the argument. So I didn't really feel prepared to make a video. And even now, I want to say that there's still a lot of issues I need to read through. I intend to look at both websites, the In and Out campaign. I will say that I'm a lot more swayed to the In campaign, um, but it's not that clear cut. I don't have as much conviction on this at this stage as I did on the question of Scottish separatism. Now, on that issue, it was clear cut. It was like breathing to me. Scotland needed to stay in the UK. That was clear cut. But for me, this issue is a bit more, I wouldn't say a bit more complex, but not as straight cut for me. Um, I've just watched the Prime Minister's uh, speech to the media at the end of what's been very long negotiations. I imagine he's physically exhausted. And I do think that negotiations with Brussels and in the EU infrastructure is one of the toughest jobs that any Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has. But it is interesting that every Prime Minister has essentially ultimately been pro EU, including Thatcher, by the way. I don't think that Thatcher would have ultimately wanted us to pull out. Although at times she came across as Eurosceptic, I don't think she would have wanted us to pull out of the system altogether. Um, so Major, Blair, Brown, and now Cameron have all ultimately come down as pro EU. Now, to the UKippers of this world, that means they're all traitors. Okay, if that's your position, that's your position. But I want to lay out a few points here, and I want to emphasise that there is a lot more information I need to learn about this. I've only caught the end of this speech and I haven't followed the issue closely, so I'm not pretending that I know all the details here. Okay, I'm being very upfront about that, being very candid about it. But I'm just want to voice some of my reflections and concerns and thoughts at this stage. Um, I will say about 5 to 10 years ago, I was pretty much very passionately pro EU. Now, like I say, I still am pro EU, but maybe if I'm being brutally honest, less so than before. I still think it is a case of, well, as one woman put it in Shetland yesterday, they were sort of canvassing views. She said, better the devil you know. In other words, both options could cause problems, but it's better to keep with what we know. For me, there is simply too many question marks about leaving. Now, someone made a link, acquaintance of mine made a link on Facebook, and it sort of showed this cartoon about like Britain as a dystopian future, and the caption underneath said, "This is what pro EU people think will happen if we leave the EU, and this is what pro leaving or pro Brexit people will think will happen if we stay." In other words, both sides are guilty to some extent of scaremongering. Um, no, I wouldn't say I'm in the middle. I am more pro EU, but that doesn't mean that I am slavishly pro EU. But anyway, back to what the Prime Minister's point. Today he was talking about the outcome of these negotiations. Angela Merkel, Donald Tusk, Francois Hollande, and others speaking afterwards as well. This was being covered on CNN, so obviously it has international interest. Um, I really, really do think that Cameron is between a rock and a hard place, and I honestly think, and this is from someone who's not a conservative and who doesn't vote for his party, I honestly think the man is trying his level best to get a compromise. And he can be mocked by Eurosceptics, but I think he's trying his level best to get a compromise. He is trying his level best to put Britain's interests first. And if what he said today is accurate, and I've no reason to believe that it isn't, then those are some pretty solid proposals. For example, on and again, I wasn't taking notes as he was speaking, so I'm not going to quote this word for word, but basically, he was speaking about reforms to the way EU migrants can claim benefits, reforms to the fact that we will keep pound sterling no matter what. Um, so there's not going to be any risk of us being forced to join the euro. And there was other things that Cameron says has been achieved by these meetings. He was also very careful to say it's not the end of calling for EU reform. Um, and he also thanked the other EU countries for dedicating 2 days to the United Kingdom. I think that is important, and I think it's also important to point out both Angela Merkel and Manuel Valls of France went out of their way to kind of give Cameron or give Britain a carrot, so to speak, in the sense of, oh, well, I'll put it another way, cutting Cameron some slack. They know he's got a very tough job in what, in many ways, is a Eurosceptic country. But the thing about the British is we love to complain about something, and I'm generalising here, but we love to complain about something, and ultimately, in the end of the day, think, well, actually, would be better keeping it. That is very much a British thing. We're not a radical revolutionary country, in the same way some other countries would be. It's just not in our nature, in my view. At least not on those sort of issues. I'm not saying not on social issues, but on those sort of constitutional issues. Um, this is something presumably a lot of Cameron's political opponents would back him on. A good proportion of Labour, though not all of Labour, but some of the most Eurosceptic people you will find is traditional left wing Labourites. In fact, I believe it was Hugh Gaitskell that bemoaned the EU as ending 1,000 years of history. The thing about Euroscepticism is it does cross party lines, and pro European positions also cross party lines. You'll find pro Europeans in the Tories, in Labour, in the Lib Dems, overwhelmingly in the Lib Dems, I might add. And you'll find Brexit people in the Tories, in Labour, obviously in UKIP. Um, I will say one thing to any potential UKIPers. If you come on this video when you're prepared to be civil and talk to me in a civil way, and make your case, fair enough. I'm going to keep my comment section open. But I have made videos about the EU before, and unfortunately has attracted UKIP people who have just come on and basically ranted, called me a traitor, and this sort of thing. If you're planning to do that, fuck you. I'm going to delete your comment because I don't think it helps the debate. Um, and UKIPers have to me, their whole message is negativity. It's about the EU is this big monstrous dictatorship that needs to be stopped. And Farage is a very capable, intelligent man. He's a very skilled politician. But I just don't buy into this argument that if we leave the world's biggest trading bloc, then everything will be wonderful and we'll suddenly have no bureaucracy. I mean, among many other things, one thing that concerns me is the complication of trade negotiations outside the EU after we've left this mechanism. I think it would be a lot more complex. I think it is also telling that some of our biggest international trade partners and political allies, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, all are wary about a Brexit. Um, I understand that Nigel Farage and co sort of see themselves as the Duke of Wellington, and this is a really revolutionary thing to leave the EU. But ultimately, I just think it's too much of a gamble. And that's not a case of saying, oh, well, we're scared of the system, so we'll stay in to obey it. I do believe that we should be pushing hard for reforms, and I do believe that we should be asking tough questions. And I do believe that Brussels is far too bureaucratic. But ultimately, when I weigh both sides up, um, one area I'm interested in, very interested in, is on crime, because I don't think that Brussels should be setting demands for British legislation in terms of our own law and justice. And that's something that is definitely, I think, a legitimate point, to be fair, of the Eurosceptics. I'm not as pro Europe as I used to be, so I guess I'm a bit more open minded to some of their grievances. but I still just don't see that leaving will. I think they have this kind of idea that we'll suddenly be this prosperous country with no problems and no complex negotiations if we leave the EU. I just don't see that. I think it's naive in the extreme, in the same way that Scotland leaving the UK was naive. The irony about this is the SNP is pro EU, and I suspect many of those who were pro, for the union were Eurosceptics. So I find myself being a unionist in both cases. Um, I do respect the position that the Prime Minister is in, and I think David Cameron has really been trying his level best here, but he's not going to be thanked for that. If we do have a June referendum, I'll make a lot more videos before that when I get more information, when I solidify my own opinions. But if it's a June referendum, at this stage, I'm going to say I hope we stay in. Not because I'm slavishly pro EU. I think, by the way, there's a difference between calling yourself a European, and I believe that there are people who identify themselves as Europeans, including in the UK, who are skeptical of EU as the EU as an institution, and I totally respect that because I can understand it. For myself, I'm not going to apologise for calling myself a European. I am a European. I am a Briton first and foremost, but I am a European. And, you know, these people who come out with sort of this notion that Europe is some completely different place, A, they're very ignorant about British history, but B, I'm not going to tell other people how to describe themselves, so they have no right to tell me that I can't call myself a European. I am a European, and that does not make me a traitor. I love the United Kingdom, but I'm a European as well. And I just think that there are pros and cons on both sides. I think at the moment the pros of the EU outweigh the cons. Mm, if I was a business person, I would be wary about leaving. But anyway, I'm going to look more into this issue. I'm not finalising at the moment. Um, I'm going to look more into the issue. I'm just more swayed towards the inside of the argument, and I do respect David Cameron for trying his level best. Obviously, it's a job, but he has a very very tough job, and I think we should respect that fact. I think if we leave the EU, Cameron will almost certainly lose his job, and there's people like Michael Gove and Boris Johnson already eyeing the top prize, so to speak. I believe that in the case of Johnson, I think it's pure opportunism on his part, and I've heard that Theresa may do it as well. Um, I hope they don't. I mean, I hope Theresa May doesn't, but we'll see what happens. Um, I'm not sure what Jeremy Corbyn's position is. I haven't seen him make a lot of public statements on this. Then again, I've been distracted by other news, but it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think fundamentally we need to stay in. I think there's a lot more arguments in favour of staying in, especially with these reforms, rather than this massive gamble of leaving, because ultimately it is just speculation. The From what I can see, the Eurosceptic people can't really come up with an argument for a lot of the points that are being making. For example, about British jobs that rely directly on the EU. Now, what do Eurosceptics say to that? For example, there's many, many public projects across the UK that are directly funded by the EU. Now, I don't know if the money would be pulled if we leave. I don't know, but I just think it's too much of a gamble. Free movement of people, by the way, includes us. It means that when we go on holiday to your country in mainland Europe, we don't need to worry about a visa. Some people may say that's a small price to pay, but I say it's a wonderful thing to have that sort of freedom. Um, Okay, I'll leave it there. Again, I'll allow opinions from both sides, provided that they're civil. If you're a Eurosceptic, that's fine. I'll allow your opinion, but I'm not going to tolerate any abusive comments against myself or against other people. I want this debate to remain civil. Um, Thank you.